the history of the village for Sheryl. I don't want to age you. I don't want to date you, so I don't even know how.
So, yeah, 15.
Long time.
Yeah.
She is very well versed in the various histories available to us. Some of you may have watched her Arch lecture, which is fascinating as always. And so we'll just give it another minute before we get started. You know, some people sign on right at 12:30. And Sheryl and I were just talking about how bizarre it is that it's already 4th of July weekend. And all right, Sheryl, if you want to go ahead and get started, it's 12:31.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. I really appreciate your introducing me. So you know we are recording this, so you will receive a recording of it. Just give us a few days to process. So this talk comes out of a few weeks ago. We talked about our very monumental and stately arch, which you've been seeing in the news lately, and everyone was asking lots of questions about the fountain. So we figured that it would be a good idea to just take you through the history of this space and really kind of situate the fountain in both the park's history, but also in the park's landscape, because the fountain hasn't always been where it is now, and the fountain hasn't always been the same fountain. So for those of you who were here for the arch talk, just as this wasn't the first arch, what we have now is not the first fountain. So here we go. So, and Grace, do let me know about that sound. I keep getting traffic on the street, but it's so nice out I don't want to close the window.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right.
If anyone else is struggling, type it in the chat and Sheryl will see it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I don't want anyone to not hear. Okay. So for most of you who have been, out and about in Washington Square, you know that we're a fairly old park. The park comes into existence in 1827, following the closure of the Potter's Field that was on this land, and following the change of use from this area to a potter's field to a parade ground. So beginning in 1827, there's a series of landscape changes, and I have brought you to all the way up to 1848. So between 1827 and 1848, there are a number of different changes to the landscapes of the park. But in 1848, I'm going to start there because we only have half an hour. This is the plan from the NYC Parks Department that brings us the fountain. So what's happening in the 1840s that we want to kind of think about something as kind of extravagant as a display fountain? And that is the engineering marvel of the Croton Aqueduct. So in the 1840s, New York City gets running water for the first time. And, I think actually this is the perfect time to talk about how important clean running water is during a pandemic when we've all been washing our hands so assiduously. This really ushers in just new ways of cleanliness, new ways of servicing people, and the city wants to celebrate that. And so a number of display fountains go up across New York City parks. A display fountain is added to the park at City Hall. There are display fountains added to Central Park. There are Madison Square Park. So fountains become very important for the city to kind of celebrate this marvel that is the Croton Aqueduct. So very early in the park's history, the fountain becomes a real showstopper. Just move to there we go. So this is it's a slightly distorted photograph. It's an early photograph, but you're very close up on the fountain. And just to put it in perspective, because the buildings surrounding this are not the same as they are now, you are looking from, say, if you were standing on the west side of Fountain Plaza, looking east towards Broadway. this is what you would be seeing in this photo. So the building that you see a little bit obscured by trees is the first university building of New York University. And the building that you're seeing on the right is a church. Now, neither of those buildings are still with us today, but you can see that open space towards Broadway, and you can see people really gathering here. And this photograph, it's early for a photograph, but it dates to the early 1850s. And so you can see that this is a bigger fountain than the one we have now. It was actually 100 foot in diameter, and it is very much a display fountain. I'm just going to show you a picture from the mid-1850s, and you are looking again from west to east. Those same buildings that I mentioned are on the upper or mid left of your the photograph here, or sorry, the etching here. And you can see this is Washington Square South, as you haven't seen it before, I'm sure. And you can see the fountain in the middle with some rather large plumes. I don't know the technical specs of the fountain, the first fountain, but it did rise quite high. And you can see some of those same diagonal paths that we saw in that original 1848 plan here in the park. So there's this great kind of feeling of meandering, say, that looks a little bit more like you might think about Central Park now. The lines are a little bit more straight than you would think of, than like an Olmsted plan, but you can see that there's some good paths to go through in the park here. This is one of my favorite. Drawings, because it really gives us this sense of the park with that architecture really at the beginning of the park's history. So, okay, so while we talk today, we'll talk both about physical changes to the fountain as well as the placement of the fountain. And what I want to talk about now is both. So in 1870, the Parks Department gets a new commissioner. His name is Boss Tweed, William Boss Tweed, who is known as one of the most corrupt politicians in all of New York City history. As commissioner, one of the things he did was make physical changes to our parks. And this is the change that you see. So, and this is a significant one, and this is really going to take us through the next 100 years. So the park will remain in some shape or fashion looking like this really until the 1960s and 70s. So in 1870, Boss Tweed wants to connect basically Fifth Avenue with a southern Fifth Avenue, right? We know that that's not the way it exists, but he wanted to connect Fifth Avenue. He wanted to bring it south and bring the south to the north. And so he wanted a roadbed through Washington Square. So he digs up the old fountain, starts putting in a roadbed. There is an economic recession that goes across the country in the early 1870s. An architect named Jacob Ray Mould, who you know for several buildings in Central Park, is tapped to design a fountain, but because there's no more money, they wind up reusing a fountain that they take from basically from the bottom of Central Park, and that is our current fountain. So I don't have a picture of the fountain from the 1870s, but this is the early 1900s, and it's just off the screen. You can see it in the bottom there, the left-hand bottom of your screen. So this is basically the 1870 plan. Now, once it happened, the community hated the roadbed, and on and off from the 1870s until really the early 1900s, There's a road, it's not a road, it's a road, it's not a road. But from the early 1900s on, it becomes a road. So one of the things that is, let me just go back one. Oops, excuse me, let me go back one. One of the things you can see missing in this diagram is the arch. So for those of you who joined us, the arch is built from 1890 to 1892. And so it's many years before the arch is even built when the fountain kind of gets its current placement. So there you can see what the arch does to add to the place of the fountain in Washington Square. And I just want to show you a close-up as well, just so you can get a little bit of a better sense of what the fountain looked like. And this is from 1905. And you can see, I think it's very interesting, you can see like there's this large sidewalk around the fountain, so it's inviting people to come. You can see the traffic barriers kind of sending traffic to the east side, and so the west side is open for pedestrian use. But technically, these are road beds. So if you were to look up New York City plans, this is not parkland here from the 1870s on, but road bed. So the road becomes the defining characteristic, in my opinion, of the landscape of the central fountain area for quite some time. So I'm going to jump ahead again. So from the early 1900s until the 1930s, the park really, or the fountain really, functions as it has. And then in the 1930s, there is another large change. And this change comes from another monumental figure of history that we all love to loathe. His name is Robert Moses. And Robert Moses, besides many other titles that he holds, becomes New York City Parks Commissioner. He will come and try and touch Washington Square Park multiple times. There are multiple plans that he develops for Washington Square, and actually the first plan he develops sends traffic around the park, not through the park. But what he does, and that plan, I should have showed it for you all, but what that plan does is creates a central pool. Now, the 1930s, remember, this is the Great Depression. So again, all these changes happening during times of economic strife. What he does is he turns the fountain from a display fountain into a pool. So this is a wading pool, and you can see at this point, there's no more fence around it. And there's another distinctive feature, and I apologize, I was not able to find very many close-ups, but interior steps are added in the 1930s. You can see the steps kind of barely in this photograph, but that invites people into this now wading pool as opposed to a display fountain. So here we are looking north, and in our next photo, you have the same view, but looking south. And again, you can see the fountain is surrounded by a road bed, but operationally, they're just using the east side as the way for traffic to go through. You can see that changing the fountain into a wading pool really changes the space a bit, because all of a sudden there's more people in this center space. And it is my belief that from this time forward, the fountain really becomes this focal point for people to be, not just to look at. So we'll just go to the next photo, and you can just see a little bit better the steps in this photo. And again, this is from the 1930s, and this particular, the last three photos you have seen have been from the New York City Parks Archive. People look like they're having fun. Probably be nice on a day like today or tomorrow or this weekend. And finally, I just wanted to share with you an overview spot, because to me, this really, and this is from the 1950s, this really kind of to me shows just the centerness of the fountain, and how folks are really kind of joining in to this central place. I do not have for you, and I've been trying to find this for a long time. I'd really like to find the date when it went from being a wading pool back to a display fountain. I don't know that answer. I will continue to look for it. But honestly, since the 1930s, even though it is technically a display fountain today and not a wading pool, the Parks Department does not kick people out unless they're using it for bathing or washing their dogs or doing laundry or something along those lines. So it's by popular demand a kind of place where you can, allow your kids to go in and put your feet in and all that. Not all display fountains across the country do that, but Washington Square is by tradition rather than rule. All right, so that takes us to our next. Oh, no, it does not. So here, I wanted to just share some of these photos. This is from 1956, a woman eating ice cream at the Museum of the City of New York. Again, people are congregating here, and it doesn't even look like the fountain is filled at this point, but it is still a point of congregation. And again, this is one of my favorite photos ever. This is by a photographer named Robert Otter. You can actually see his archive of photographs from basically documenting the West Village in the 1960s online at robertotter.com. And I do believe they are for sale, but I just love the photo before. It's not as mixed. It's maybe a little bit fancier. And as we progress from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s, you can see kind of our culture just becoming more casual and all those fun things. So, and then this is mid 60s. Again, this is Nat Norman, the same one who took the photo of the woman eating ice cream. And again, this crowd is a little more mixed, a little more hippie. You can see the changing neighborhood. And I think this also gives you a really good look on those steps. And you can see these are made of concrete, whereas the fountain itself is made of bluestone. So you can really see that as an addition in this picture quite clearly. Okay. All right, so the next big change that happens in regards to the fountain is to the landscape in which it stands. So this picture, entitled Last Car Through Washington Square, designates a ceremonial ribbon cutting of a decision by the Board of Estimate in 1958 to close the park to all but emergency traffic. We could do a whole lunch lecture on this topic, but thanks to neighborhood organizers like Shirley Hayes, Ray Rubinoff, the Tankles. This photograph is Stanley and Claire Tankle in that last car. This is their photograph. You can find it at Village Preservation in their archive. So basically they campaign, and there's a series of plans by Robert Moses to build a bigger roadway through Washington Square. The community fights it and decides, wait, why do we even have traffic in the first place? And so we go from having the possibility of a large roadbed going through to no roadbed at all. And in 1959, the Board of Estimate basically closes the park to all but buses. And then a few years later, the park is closed to all traffic. And at this point, we have a real opportunity. And from 1960 to 1970, the New York City Parks Department decides to undertake a renovation of Washington Square. And for the first time, since 1870, there is no roadbed going through the central park. And so the fountain can really just, become the real center, because you don't have to worry about accommodating cars. And so these are the plans from the Parks Department for that renovation. It was a long planning period. I think it completed in 1970 or 1971. And here is an early shot of the fountain following that renovation. And for those of you who have been in the neighborhood a bit, you'll remember that the fountain kind of went down a level. So it was, you know, sunken, if you will. So if the arch is at grade, the fountain went down. And so you would access first steps. Later, they were paved over to create little ramps. And a lot of kind of low walls that served as seats and benches. And the fountain really kind of takes center stage at this point. Okay, and then I just wanted to show you the same image, but a little bit later into the 80s. Because I think you can really get a sense of the stage on the east side, and to the south of the central fountain plaza, you can see Teen Plaza and the Petanque Court. And I think as we think about the park as it is now and where the fountain sits in it, it's harder to imagine so much paved space, because what I want to talk about next is the most recent renovation of the park. It took place in from 2007 to 2014, and the fountain was really the fountain plaza was really the main part of this whole renovation, because you can see how much the fountain takes center stage in the park from the 1970 renovation and to now, while increasing actual green space. So this is really fun because I don't think most of us got to see the renovation up close. It's also quite controversial. So when this renovation took place, the plan was to move the fountain 22 feet to the east. So again, the arch is not there when we get the fountain and roadbed in 1870, and the 1970 renovation is the first time that you could really address this roadbed. And what they did was they really kind of expanded, the designer's name was Robert Nichols. What he really did was kind of expand the footprint of the fountain plaza. And I think when you see the fountain today, it kind of takes that into consideration. But you also, with the fountain aligned, you're also getting both north-south and east-west viewscapes that are reminiscent of that first fountain. Remember when I showed you that image and you could see the plume and you could see Broadway. And so this kind of brings us back to that ideal of these sight lines. And the park with the fountain in the center as it is today. And this is, when you see it, you say, oh yeah, there is more green space. It's a little bit hard to see, but the most recent renovation did bring back, and I didn't write down the number, how much actual green space was brought back during this renovation. But I think today, and you see in this picture here, you still see people gathering. Some are sitting around benches that used to be low walls from the past renovation. Some are still sitting at the fountain. And then you still have the folks who kind of get up and personal with the spray. And I think really the continuity of how this has been an open space remains from before the 1970 renovation to really today through the 2007-2014 renovation. What has changed is the fountain is at grade. It is ADA accessible, which we all know is very important in today's day and age. And we have that same spirit of the fountain as central gathering place. And for the first time, taking away that space that was the roadbed and really bringing it back for people, which I think is a fabulous way to think about it. So, 25 minutes, not so bad. I wanted to leave some time for questions at the end. When we talked about the arch, we had a lot of questions. So,
Thank you
Grace.
so much, Cheryl. So we've got one very interesting question that
Mhm.
I will be upfront. I'm not sure if we even have the answer to. I
Okay.
know we have the answer for now, but it's a question about the filtration system historically.
Mm,
I know right now we use bromine, not chlorine. You can
mhm.
you can go into that a little more. But do we know anything about the filtration or cleaning of the water and the fountain from
Right,
history?
right. So you don't need filtration if it's a display fountain. So up until the 1930s, there's no need for a filtration system. When it becomes a wading pool, that's the point where you need to think about filtration and and chemicals and things like that. Um, I don't know what they used when it became a wading pool, and that is something I can look up because it's very interesting. What I do know is that the system of pipes and pumps is very complex. The whether the fountain moved or not in the last renovation, it had to be dug up because the pipes were completely shot. It had been a long time since that had been addressed, and so all of the piping was replaced in the last renovation. And the pumping system is located under the current Park House building. It did not move. That was the same location that it had been for many, many years. So the architects of that building actually built the structure around that pumping station, which is in the basement of the Park House. So that's a really great question, and we'll find out some more.
Yeah, it's actually, so we don't use chlorine in the fountain currently, but there is a chemical bromine.
Bromine, yeah, it's a little bit easier on the pipes. A lot of times people will ask, like, okay, I let my kids go in the fountain. It's not bleach, it's not chlorine bleach. I just recommend showering. You know, it, it,
And it's a big part of why we ask people not to bring animals in there.
it
But
I mean, it is technically a display fountain. Again, it's more culture than rule that people are allowed to go in. So just keep that in mind as you think about the cleanliness of it. When we're fully staffed, we're trying to empty and clean the fountain power wash once a week. Um, when we're not fully staffed, it has gone as long as once a month. But it is our goal as the Conservancy to really make sure our staffing levels are enough so that we can keep that clean and in good repair.
well, that was the only question we had this time.
Oh, interesting.
A minute or two if anyone's got one they want to slip in right under the wire. But thank you. This was fascinating as always. Much appreciated. And
Oh, of course. I hope everyone has a very good July 4th weekend. If there are topics you're hoping we'll cover in these lunch lectures, we still can't do any actual physical programming in the park. So if there's topics you want us to cover during this period, we'd love to hear. This is by popular demand. So, and Grace, what do we have next?
yes, so our next lecture is going to be on the 16th of July, and we're going to be looking at some fun little park secrets. So
Great.
bits and pieces in the park that you may or may not know are there or why they're there. So we'll delve into some of those.
Great. Sounds fun. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, thank you.
Bye-bye.